Okay, so last week what we were doing was looking at Sartre's account of the structure of consciousness. And his claim was that in relating to the world, uh, it's the fact that we're able to introduce negation into the world. So we're able to introduce this idea that something is this and not that, that makes possible the appearance of something against the horizon. So something can only appear for me as long as it's separated from its background. And that process, that separation involves the introduction of a moment of negation. So to make an object appear to me, for me to be able to attend to the world, I need to be able to introduce separation, and separation requires negation. Now, the claim that we're able to step back from the world through this process of separation is in effect the claim that we're free. And as we saw, a consequence of this freedom last week was the idea of a feeling of anguish. Now, the reason for that is that we're not free simply to choose whether to be a good person or not, or whether to be successful or not, but we're also free to choose the very structures of meaning that make possible those kinds of choices in the first place. That is, we choose the kind of person we want to be, and then that choice sets up the values by which we judge that decision. So there's a kind of circularity where we choose, but there's no foundation for the choosing we're making. Now, the outcome of the feeling of anguish is that we attempt to flee from our freedom. And the next section of Being and Nothingness that we're going to look at, the section I want to look at today, explores this attempt to flee from our freedom. And this attempt to flee from our freedom, Sartre calls bad faith. So when we act in bad faith. Now, as Sartre notes, bad faith is often understood to be a form of self-deception. So Sartre's claim is that the idea that we lie to ourselves, if you understand it in a conventional sense, is fundamentally incoherent. So that doesn't mean that a liar is living authentically, but it's at least the case that lying relies on an understanding of the structure of the self and of the self's relation to others. Now, Sartre is going to further claim that a psychoanalytical understanding of the world also has its origins in bad faith, because it attempts to reduce bad faith to this structure of lying to oneself. So what I want to do today is I want to start by laying out this account of what it is to be in bad faith and to contrast it with the idea of lying to oneself. And then I want to talk a little bit about the psychoanalytical reading of bad faith, or of lying to oneself, rather. Now, having done those, I want to go through the examples that Sartre himself gives of bad faith. So there are three key examples I want to look at. And these are the first one of these is a woman who's going on a date who tries to preserve a kind of ambiguous relation to her suitor within the date by refusing to recognise their intentions. Now, the second example is the idea of a waiter who seeks to be nothing but a waiter, seeks to define themselves purely by their role. And the third example is of a homosexual, and Sartre uses this example to consider whether we can ever say that someone is something in particular. So whether you can ever define someone by saying that they're gay, and also what it is for the homosexual in this case to deny that they're a homosexual. So can the denial that we have in essence itself be a form of bad faith? So having gone through that, I want to conclude, but I'll talk a little bit in the conclusion about the question of whether there's actually any effective way at all for Sartre of avoiding bad faith. So is it possible as a Sartrean to have anything like an account of good faith or sincerity? Okay. So in the last lecture, we talked a little bit about the way in which negation can apply to things outside of us. Now, what Sartre is really interested in the chapter on bad faith is the way in which we apply negation to ourselves. So we quite often deny who we are, for instance. Now, on the surface, these cases where we deny who we are to ourselves, these seem to be cases where we're lying to ourselves. You know, if I kind of trick myself, as it were, into believing I'm something I'm not, that seems to be a case of self-deception or lying to oneself. But when we look further, we can see that the idea of lying to oneself is very, very difficult to apply to our own actions. Now, Sartre gives the following set of conditions, the things that have to be the case in order to tell a lie to someone. So the first of these is, in order to lie, one has to believe in the truth about which one is lying. So you don't lie if you're ignorant or mistaken about something. Lying involves knowing a given truth. Second, the liar needs to express the opposite of what they believe or know to be the case. So you know something's the case, you express the opposite. Third, if the lie is successful, the other must believe what the liar says. So if I successfully lie to you, I have to know something, express the opposite of what I know, and then you have to believe what I say rather than what I actually know. Now, there's nothing particularly problematic for Sartre about the nature of lying. You know, it's like ontologically it's fine, and it involves some quite sophisticated beliefs about our nature and the nature of the other. So there's nothing inherently wrong about it. And Sartre says the following: lying presupposes my existence, the existence of the other, my existence for the other, and the existence of the other for me. There is thus no difficulty in holding that the liar must make the project of the lie in entire clarity, and that he must possess the complete comprehension of the lie and of the truth which he is altering. It's sufficient that an overall opacity hide his intentions from the other. It's sufficient that the other can take the lie for the truth. By the lie, consciousness affirms that it exists by nature as hidden from the other. It utilises for its own profit the ontological duality of myself and myself in the eyes of the other. So what Sartre is really talking about there is the way in which, when I tell a lie, I rely on this difference between the way I appear and the way I am. So what makes possible the deception of another is the fact that I myself enter into the lie in full consciousness. So this doesn't make sense in terms of the projects of bad faith. So if we're thinking about what it is to lie to myself, then this project would seem to be performatively incoherent by the fact that it involved me sort of taking on a project in full comprehension of that project while at the same time being ignorant of that project. In other words, because our intentions are transparent to ourselves, the notion of self-deception seems to be incoherent. So we don't have the same disparity between my beliefs as they actually are and my beliefs as I appear to hold them that we do when we lie to another. Okay, so there's a problem of what it is to lie to oneself. How can we not be transparent? So the most sophisticated attempt, at least the one that Sartre focuses on here, to provide an account of bad faith that does operate on this model of self-deception is the model we find in psychoanalysis. Now, Freud's model of the psyche involves essentially dividing it up into different regions. So we've got our normal conscious states, but Freud claims that our psyche also includes an unconscious that we don't have access to. Now, I'll just go through Freud's model briefly. Now, it does change over the years, and there are all sorts of modifications in Freud's thought. But for the purposes of this lecture, I'll focus on the model that Sartre is interested in, which contains three essential moments, and two of these are central to what Sartre is going to talk about. Okay, so the first structure of consciousness of the self rather, for Freud, is the id. And the id is essentially a collection of drives and instincts that contains our basic desires that we need to satisfy, and also our impulses. So the id is kind of roughly equivalent to the unconscious. Okay. Now the second structure is the ego, and this is kind of roughly analogous to the structure of consciousness itself. So the ego is essentially the organised personality structure of the subject. It's that part of the subject that's primarily concerned with the external world. So the id contains desires to be satisfied, but the ego is where we find, for instance, the idea that in order for some desires to be satisfied, others need to be suppressed. So, if I'm hungry, the id might tell me to take the food off the plates of other diners in the restaurant, but the ego realizes that there would be consequences to that course of action that would lead to other desires not being fulfilled, and so it suppresses that action in favour of other ways of relating to the world. Now, the final thing that I don't think we're going to talk about much is the superego, and the superego is essentially the internalisation of rules we get from our parents. So it's the kind of social structures that underlie, the kind of formal being in society with others. Okay. Now, if we take this model to be the structure of the ego, we can see, I hope, quite clearly how bad faith might operate as a form of self-deception. So it might be the case quite often that our conscious experience is influenced by our unconscious drives and desires. Now, there are lots of examples in Freud of this idea of the unconscious influencing consciousness. A classic example that Freud considers is the case of someone who visits a shop, and in that shop is someone they're attracted to. So someone's working in the shop. Now, they buy their goods, and having left the shop, they realise that they've left their wallet behind in the shop, which means they have to go back to retrieve it. Now, we could say that that's just a chance happening. They've just left their wallet behind. But Freud's reading would be that in that case, we're motivated by an unconscious desire that's expressed through our actions. So while it seems like it's chance that's led us to leave the wallet behind, in fact, the unconscious has kind of forced us into that situation that requires us to return to the shop and see the person we're attracted to again. Similarly, the more classic Freud example, if we've experienced some trauma in the past, it might be the case that because this trauma is too difficult for us to deal with, we repress it into the unconscious. Now, Freud's claim is that repressed behaviour continues to manifest itself in our conscious life as a form of neurosis. So we might find that the same kind of stresses that led to the trauma, we attempt to kind of repeat the action again and again, but in a kind of like neurotic form in our daily conscious life. So hysteria, for instance, might be a way in which we relieve the stress generated by an experience that we can't directly confront. So we talked about this to a large extent when we looked at the emotions, or in passing rather, this Freudian idea that you essentially attempt to that the unconscious provides a seek for significance that's expressed through our conscious actions, and so often leads us to respond emotionally in situations. Now, if we understand the unconscious in this manner, then there's going to be no difficulty in explaining how we lie to ourselves. And the reason for that is that what Sartre has been saying so far is that consciousness is essentially transparent to itself. But what Freud is arguing here is that consciousness is not transparent, and it's really grounded in another entity, which is the unconscious. So what effectively happens here is that self-deception becomes possible because the unconscious in effect acts like another person that my consciousness is in relation to. We effectively split the self into two little domains, and self-deception becomes possible because each of these domains isn't transparent to the other, in the same way that when I lie to you, if I lie to you, then that lie is based on the same lack of transparency of my thinking and your thinking. So for Freud, once again, we can explain self-deception because we've got essentially a relation of lying between two entities, the id and the ego. It just so happens that these two entities are contained within the same self. Okay. Now, what Sartre is going to argue against this kind of model is that it's essentially an incoherent view of the psyche. Now, the key thing he's going to look at is a well-known phenomenon in psychoanalysis known as resistance. Now, what happens in psychoanalytic treatment is that if one has a neurosis, so if one has a trauma in one's past that's leading to neurotic behaviour, what the analyst will try to do is treat the patient by trying to bring that neurosis into consciousness so it no longer expresses itself indirectly through behaviour. So in a sense, once that trauma has been pulled out of the unconscious and become something that we can actually deal with consciously, the trauma no longer needs to express itself through our behaviour. Now, Sartre notes that there's a psychological or a psychoanalytical phenomenon called resistance that occurs when we approach the end of a psychoanalytical treatment. So, as the complex that's in the unconscious is about to be brought to the surface, what's commonly noticed is that the patient will stop attending therapy sessions, or they may become hostile to the therapist. So there are all sorts of ways in which they try to, in a sense, prevent this trauma from coming into consciousness. Now, this presents a real problem, Sartre argues, for psychoanalysis, because it's not the case that the consciousness of the subject is responsible for the resistance. The consciousness is unaware, the ego is unaware of what's been repressed, and furthermore they've actively sought the cure for the neurosis. So we can't blame this process of resistance on the ego. Similarly, it can't be the unconscious complex itself, as such, that's responsible for this resistance, because the unconscious is actively seeking to express itself through consciousness. So it seems to be the case that this phenomenon of resistance is puzzling. It seems to be impossible to explain within psychoanalytical terms. Okay, so in order to resolve this difficulty, Sartre claims that Freud proposes that between the unconscious and consciousness is a sensor that essentially prevents the unwanted thought from reaching consciousness. Now, in order for this sensor to function, however, it needs to be conscious of what it is that it's censoring. So it knows that what it's trying to prevent from reaching consciousness. So in effect, therefore, for Sartre, Freud ends up forced to posit another consciousness between consciousness and the unconscious. And Sartre considers this situation to be absurd. Okay, so what I want to do for the rest of the lecture really is to go through some of the examples that Sartre gives of concrete patterns of bad faith. Now, as I said last week, Sartre's approach to philosophy is phenomenological, which means that he believes that we can come to an understanding of the world through a descriptive analysis of the way that phenomena appear to us. Now, that means that the discussions of these specific examples of conduct of bad faith are integral to his project. Now, the first of these examples is the example of a woman on a date, a woman in a cafe. So the example is of a man and a woman on a date where there's clearly a mutual attraction between them. Now, while she's on the date, she knows that at some point she's going to have to make a decision as to whether she kind of acts on this attraction or unambiguously closes off the possibility of going further. Now, what Sartre's analysis of the woman's conduct in this situation works off is the idea that she wants two very different and contradictory things from this situation. On the one hand, she wants the man to respect who she is and to show that he respects her in terms of her projects, her beliefs and her thoughts. So she wants the man to respect her as a consciousness that transcends or is more than her purely physical nature. On the other hand, as Sartre notes, she doesn't just want to be seen that way. Now, Sartre puts the point as follows. He says, yet she would find no charm in a respect which would be only respect. In order to satisfy her, there must be a feeling which is addressed wholly to her personality, i.e. to her whole freedom, and which would be a recognition of her freedom. But at the same time, this feeling must be wholly desire, that is, it must address itself to her body as object. Now, she's scared about this relationship collapsing purely into desire. She wants to keep this ambiguity in the situation, according to Sartre. So at first, she deliberately ignores the fact that the man's statements refer beyond the present situation to future possibilities. So, for example, when he says, "I find you so attractive," she ignores any of the implications of that statement. She ignores the fact that, he's kind of proposing a way, like a future set of projects for them in making that statement. What he's in effect doing is ignoring the fact that she knows that his statements and his nature, his sincerity, for instance, are not objective, fixed things, but are relations to his projects and his aims. So what he says is related to what he wants to do. So in effect, she reduces him to a thing. Now this allows her to recognise his desire for her, as well as his respect for her, without having to take into account the consequences of that desire. Now, Sartre pushes this situation further by asking what happens if the man puts his hand on the woman's hand. Now, according to Sartre, this radically changes the situation. Because what the man has done here is essentially put the woman in a position where she either has to accept his advances, or by removing her hand from his, she has to destroy this kind of delicate ambiguity in the situation. So how does the woman respond to this situation? Now, Sartre's claim is that what the woman does in this case is she essentially fails to notice that the man has put his hand on hers. So she talks about art and morality and other themes that speak to her nature as a kind of a mind and a personality. Now, what Sartre claims here is that in ignoring or remaining indifferent to his hand on hers, she's acting in bad faith. Now, she's already in bad faith to a certain degree, to the extent that she deliberately discounts the fact that the cues that she's receiving refer beyond the present moment towards the future projects of the man she's with. So there's already an element of bad faith there. But more so, she shows her bad faith for Sartre when the man places his hand on hers. So, in ignoring his action, what she's doing is she's relying on the dual nature of our physical being, our dual nature of ourselves as a physical being and also a consciousness. So on the one hand, for Sartre, we're our facticity. I'm a certain height, I have a certain job, a certain past. But on the other hand, I'm also transcendence. It's me who chooses the significance for these facts. So what we are is an interrelation of the kind of factical basis for our lives and our transcendence of those. What the woman in bad faith attempts to do is take these two moments that make us up and kind of split them apart ontologically. So on the one hand, she considers herself to be a pure transcendence by talking purely about cerebral topics. But on the other, she treats her body as simply an object that's external to her, like a pure facticity. So in this case, what Sartre is arguing is that bad faith here relies on this deliberate misinterpretation of the ambiguity of our nature as a combination of transcendence and factical existence. Okay. The second example Sartre introduces is that of the waiter who aims to be nothing but a waiter. Now, Sartre describes this situation as follows. He says, what are we then if we have the constant obligation to make ourselves what we are, if our mode of being is having the obligation to be what we are? Let us consider this waiter in the café. His movement is quick and forward, a little too precise, a little too rapid. He bends forward a little too eagerly, his voice, his eyes express an interest a little too solicitous for the order of the customer. Finally, there he returns, trying to imitate in his walk the inflexible stiffness of some kind of automaton, while carrying a tray with the recklessness of a tightrope walker, by putting it in a perpetually unstable, perpetually broken equilibrium, with which he perpetually re-establishes by a light movement of the arm and hand, all which he perceptually re-establishes with a light movement of his arm and hand. All his behaviour seems to us a game. He applies himself to changing his movements as if they were mechanisms, the one regulating the other. His gesture and even his voice seem to be mechanisms. He gives himself to the quickness and pitiless rapidity of things. He is playing, he is amusing himself. But what is he playing? We need not watch long before we can explain it. He is playing at being the waiter in the cafe. There is nothing there to surprise us. Okay, so as Sartre notes, in fact, it is impossible for us to be a waiter, to actually just be a waiter, or to be a student, or to be a university lecturer. Things outside of us, can be exactly what they are. So as Sartre says, an inkwell is nothing but an inkwell. But as we've seen like last week, the nature of consciousness is fundamentally unthing-like. So because we're fundamentally free to change our projects, and because our attitudes and our actions at this minute refer beyond themselves to the horizon of the future, we simply can't understand ourselves in the same way that we understand the things around us. So, as we saw last week, and we'll see again next week, essentially for Sartre, we're at a distance from ourselves in a way that things aren't. So why might we want to see ourselves as a thing if we're not a thing? Well, Sartre gives two reasons really why we might want to characterise ourselves or other people in the same way that we characterise things. So first, because of the structure of social relations, we're often forced to treat others as means to ends. So seeing someone as a thing facilitates this process. It kind of removes our unease at dealing with another person as a means to a particular end. So Sartre talks about this as follows. He says, a grocer who dreams is offensive to the buyer because such a grocer is not wholly a grocer. Society demands that he limit himself to his function as a grocer. Just as the soldier at attention makes himself into a soldier thing with a straight look that does not see at all. So that's the first possibility, the first factor, that there's something difficult about the way society forces us to treat other people as means to ends when we know that they're not. So we have a tendency to objectify them into those roles. Now, second, by seeing ourselves as fully determined, we don't have to worry about being free. So if we see ourselves purely as an object, we're effectively abdicating responsibility for choosing the meaning for our own lives. Now, since the structure of consciousness is fundamentally different from the structure of a thing, I simply can't coincide with myself as a representation of myself as a waiter or as a lecturer. There's always going to be a separation between the way in which I represent myself and my proper nature. As such, it's also the case, though, that we are under an obligation to take up certain roles in order to exist within society. So therefore, I'm in the position of relating to a person I both have to be and who I'm not. So when one argues that I can be what I am, as the waiter seeks to be a waiter, then that person is in bad faith because they ignore the separation between themselves and their representation of themselves. Now, that's going to lead to the final case that I want to look at today, and that's the example that Sartre develops in terms of the homosexual, because in this case we've got a notion of bad faith where someone, rather than trying to be an object, denies their essence, but according to Sartre, denies their essence in such a way that they also fall into bad faith. So I'll read out the example and then we can go through this. I can go through it in the seminar as well, but I'll kind of work through what's going on here. Okay, so a homosexual frequently has an intolerable feeling of guilt, and his whole existence is determined in relation to this feeling. One will readily foresee he's in bad faith. In fact, it frequently happens that this man, while recognising his homosexual inclination, while avowing each and every particular misdeed he's committed, refuses with all his strength to consider himself a pederast. His case is always different, peculiar. There enters into it something of a game, of chance, of bad luck. The mistakes are always in the past. They are explained by a certain conception of the beautiful, which women cannot satisfy. We should see in them the results of a restless search, rather than the manifestations of a deeply rooted tendency, etc., etc. Here is assuredly a man in bad faith who borders on the comic, since, acknowledging all the facts which are imputed to him, he refuses to draw from them the conclusion which they impose. His friend, who is his most severe critic, becomes irritated with this duplicity. The critic asks only one thing, and perhaps then he will show himself indulgent: that the guilty one recognise himself as guilty, that the homosexual desire declare frankly, whether humbly or boastfully matters little, I am a pederast. We ask here, who is in bad faith, the homosexual or the champion of sincerity? So if we think about the homosexual in this case, then his denial of what at the time would have been an accusation appears to be in line with Sartre's ethics. So it appears to be the case that in charting a path that's the opposite of the waiter, that perhaps the homosexual finds a way of living in good faith. So the man here is denying that his essence can be captured by a given trait. And every time that it appears that his actions would define him as a homosexual, he claims that these actions simply are not definitive of what he is. Now, what Sartre's claim here is that he doesn't deny himself in a way that kind of points to good faith. Rather, what he's doing in his denials is not denying that he has an essence, but denying that his essence is the essence of the homosexual. So his denial is effectively simply the claim that this here is not his essence. So to use Sartre's claim, his claim to not being a pederast, he lays claim to not being a pederast in the sense in which a table is not an inkwell. So at the heart of the denial here is the same notion that consciousness can be understood as an object, and the homosexual simply denies that he's a homosexual, in the form of denying that this particular essence is his essence. But he doesn't deny that there's a problem with applying categories of essence full stop to human consciousness. Now, what about the man who styles himself as a champion of sincerity? Well, this figure too acts in bad faith for Sartre. Because in asking the question, his aim is to get the homosexual to determine himself as such. Now, what he's trying to do there, according to Sartre, is essentially domesticate the freedom of the homosexual by bringing it into this domain of judgment. Okay, so I think that last case is really interesting. So we can talk about that in more detail in the seminars. But I want to ask one last question today, and that's: is it possible to act in a way that avoids the kind of bad faith we've been looking at today? Well, it appears potentially that that's not possible. So even the project of attempting to act in sincerity appears to be infected by bad faith. And Sartre gives the following brief description of the project of attempting to be sincere. The man who confesses that he is evil has exchanged his disturbing freedom for evil for an inanimate character of evil. He clings to himself. He is what he is. But by the same stroke, he escapes from that thing, since it is he who contemplates it, since it depends on him to maintain it under his glance or to let it collapse in an infinity of particular acts. So sincerity, therefore, relies on this same idea that we consider ourselves as a thing which we find at the heart of bad faith. So in that case, we essentially claim to be a subject that we're not, in order to escape for responsibility for our actions by giving us the solidity of a thing. So we effectively, when we're sincere, Sartre, we say, well, I'm just that kind of person. And that's in itself a way of kind of escaping from the anguish of being free by giving ourselves a solid foundation. Now, perhaps the conclusion of Sartre's discussion here is that if we accept the assumptions that he's making about the nature of humanity, then it's impossible to escape the structures of bad faith. Now, the reason for this is that any attempt to try to be something is going to impose on us an ideal or a representation that we can't accord with, simply because consciousness is not a thing. Perhaps if we take this idea that positing an ideal is fundamental to the essence of consciousness, then there might be some way of acting authentically. So all projects are going to involve a split between consciousness and our representation of it. but some presumably enter into, or we enter into, with a knowledge and an affirmation of the problematic interconnection between consciousness and our representation of consciousness. So some projects will embrace the paradoxical nature of human beings as free, whereas others will simply attempt to cover over our nature is free by playing on this same split between consciousness and representation. So later on in Being and Nothingness, we'll explore this to some extent, the degree to which, despite the paradoxical nature of human consciousness, some projects are perhaps better able to affirm the paradoxical structure of human agency than others. Okay, thanks a lot.